Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our special coverage of the Russia-Ukraine file. Russia's military operation in Ukraine is already more than 3 weeks old, and the death toll in the bitter conflict is already likely to have exceeded 10,000. But there is also no sign of a decisive military breakthrough on either side, which could have important consequences for what is to come. On the one hand, Russia's attack on its neighbor has been so poorly coordinated that it has left many military experts baffled. Yet, while Ukraine's defense has been exceptionally determined, it is also clear that it cannot force out the 150,000 invading troops from its territory. This and more will be discussed with our panel of guests. We have Benjamin Barton, Assistant Professor at the Nottingham University. Thank you for joining us. And Abdul Wahab Nasri, Global Affairs Activist and International Relations Researcher. Thank you for joining us. The discussion begins right after this break. Before we delve into discussion, let me share with you, dear viewers and our dear guests, with some live updates of the hour. Russian strikes have hit the capital Kiev and Kharkiv and Kramatorsk in the east, causing casualties, Ukrainian officials say. Missiles have destroyed an aircraft repair plant near the airport in the western Ukrainian city of Lviv. Mayor Andriy Sadovy says Russian troops and separatist allies are fighting in the center of the Mariupol against nationalists, according to the Russian Defense Ministry. Ukraine says 3,810 people were evacuated from cities on Thursday, including about 2,000 who left the besieged city of Mariupol. U.S. President Joe Biden is expected to warn Chinese President Xi Jinping against supporting Russia during a phone call on Friday. Based on these updates, and military and intelligence analysts and Ukraine scholars offered a somber assessment of the weeks ahead in Ukraine, saying that despite the resistance offered by Ukrainian fighters, the situation is likely to get worse before it gets better. Former U.S. Defense Secretary Ashton Carter said on Wednesday at Harvard Kennedy School JFK Junior Forum that the invasion's slow pace is going to make Russia's President Vladimir Putin anxious to bring it to a conclusion. What's your take on this, Professor Barton? Benjamin Barton, you can hear me?
Yes, I can, yes. Thank you very much for inviting me. Where Putin stands right now is that he's already supposedly started to lay out an exit strategy in terms of presenting his ultimate demands to the Ukraine, which involve, on the one hand, the Ukraine accepting defeat, and on the other hand, also accepting that it no longer would become a candidate country to join NATO. So you can see already that there is in the works an attempt by the Russians to devise, in effect, this kind of an exit strategy, simply because, as you mentioned already, the campaign isn't going as well as it is supposed to, and is not necessarily going according to plan.
Very nice indeed. Abdul Wahab Nasri, what about you? Experts foresee worse coming in the days ahead. It is going a lot worse than Putin expected. Therefore, there is going to be some desperation. And he's going to turn the dial up on the violence. What do you think?
Well, greetings. First of all, I'm delighted to join you here at the channel. Well, as a student researcher in the field of global affairs, I would like to mention some important points about the Russians' war on Ukraine exactly, and the changes in the international phenomena and the arena exactly. So the Russians' war on Ukraine, and other thinkers, they call it that repercussions of the Russians-Ukraine wars. In parentheses, the repercussions on the territorial and the international scene. So that will be one of the files that will change the nature of the international arena. And from the previous information, we can ask and focus on a number of questions in order to understand the aspects of this phenomenon exactly. So the first question I think we have to think about it is why has the situations on Ukraine worsened in what is it today? And second question is what are the realistic causes of this war? The third question, it will be how will be the Ukraine war affect in Russian-Chinese relations, whatever in cooperation and in conflict? And the fourth question will be what are the most important permanent possibles and extracts that will be effects on the structure and the features of the international system, because this war exactly will change it, definitely the international system that will be in the next maybe years or in the next decades. So that it depends on the factors that we will analyze. And of course, we will try to focus on the security and the economic and also the political factors, whatever with borders and whatever with the biosphere that is important in geopolitics. Because all we know that the territorial nature between Russia and Ukraine is depend on the biosphere armament. So that this is the basic conflict, and the conflict here, it will be whatever directly or indirectly. So we have to say all the thinkers in the international relations, by the way, are thinking that sometimes it is war and sometimes it is a conflict, so that it depends always on the repercussions.
Very nice. Russian strikes hit Kiev, Lviv in the west, and Kharkiv and Kramatorsk in the east. A residential building in the Podilevsky district of Kiev collapsed after being hit by a strike, while isolated explosions targeting apartment buildings in the Ukrainian capital continue to awaken residents in daily terror. I get back to you, Professor Barton. Putin's tactics were described unbelievably brutal, used to subdue the civilian population of Chechnya, for example, once upon a time, where casualties were estimated in the tens of thousands. If Putin appears interested in finding a way out of the conflict short of resorting to that brutality, Western nations should help him find it. What do you think?
Well, I think the West, I'm not sure there's really a lot of desire to want to help Putin in any way. I mean, he was already, in a way, before this conflict blew up, persona non grata in a number of Western forums, international forums, of course, dating back to what happened in 2014. Now, of course, it's not in the interest of the West for this to escalate into outright conflict between NATO and Russia, and in addition, it's in no one's interest, and particularly those countries which, abide by the humanitarian principles or the R2P principles, which have been, drafted at the level of the United Nations, and in terms of intervening in order to protect civilians in conflict situations. It's not in the interest of Western countries to see that happen either. So this is the quagmire that we find ourselves in. It's who effectively can really break the ice, because the lack of trust on both sides is non-existent. The Russians don't trust Western counterparts on a number of levels, whether it's in terms of the Ukraine, the expansion of Western borders up until Russia's borders, and vice versa. The West does not trust Putin, and I mean hasn't for a long time. But this war has just confirmed all of the worst suspicions that they had about him. So I guess that's why there is a space for diplomatic maneuver, which doesn't involve necessarily just the West and Russia. I think Turkey is trying to fill that space. Others at the United Nations are also trying to fill that space. But I think it will be absolutely necessary for there to be something of a kind of neutral third-party broker in this, because otherwise we have to accept that, one or either side makes some kind of concession to bring this war to an end, and that doesn't look likely right now.
Very nice. While the timing perhaps was unexpected, nobody should be surprised that Putin took such a step, since he has made plain his grievances with the West and views of former Soviet nations since 2007, when he gave a speech in Munich. Didn't that foreshadow these hostilities, Professor Nasri?
Okay, here we will mention the duality of conflict and the war and the cooperation also between the Russians and the China as a factor of changing in the international arena. As well as the Russians' war on Ukraine, it will be a little bit affected on the world. So that all we know that we are moving into the fifth industrial revolution. So in the international arena, we need to take that realistic visions. So all the thinkers, they are using the realistic approach. And as we see here, the most thinkers of the foreign policy, especially Jean Mearsheimer, so that he was always taking an action into Russia. So all we know that Ukraine, it is taking the role of mediation in the international framework. And all we know that the NATO's framework will be affected negatively on the procedures of United Nations also. We know United Nations trying to take chief warns if in order to face the Russians' violations. And also we know that the China also taking to mention Taiwan in order within their procedures also. So you can say here the duality of conflict is really hard to deal with. And we have to take a futuristic vision always, so that we have to wait and to see in order to take an action about that, and to extract at least 2 or 3 theories, new theories here, I mean, in the field of international relations.
Very nice. And in a different note, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky delivered a speech to members of the German Bundestag, the lower house of the German parliament, where he was applauded at the start and at the end of his speech, hours after his intervention in front of the German parliament. The Ukrainian president declared that the opinion of the Germans is changing. Let's have a listen. What could Germany do for Ukraine, according to you, Professor Benjamin Barton?
Well, Germany can do one of many things, and we've seen already that the Germans have been willing to mobilize funds in the billions of euros to purchase weapons, which might be directly sent to the battlefield, or in any case send out a very strong signal to the Russians that NATO member states, and even those who perhaps traditionally, historically, since the end of the Second World War, have abided by, let's say, a kind of peace identity, peace state identity, peaceful constitution, and so on, are willing to put behind them 70 years of peace if necessary, if things get out of hand. Obviously, Germany is hugely important in NATO, perhaps even more important at the level of the European Union. It's the largest member state. It's, some have argued, a hegemon in Europe. So, of course, having Germany's support is a very strong message. And let's also not forget about energy. When it comes to the purchase of oil and natural gas from Russia, Germany was one of Russia's number one clients, if not the number one client in Europe. And a base from which to distribute these primary commodities to other European countries. And the Germans have now said that they're willing to go back on that, only a few months after accepting that nuclear reactors could not be an option. So this really shows the extent to which countries are willing to go to stand up to the face of Russian aggression. And I guess the last point to mention here is that this is really also, these kind of images, this kind of support provided by European countries to the Ukraine is also in a way to make sure that the general population in countries like Germany, throughout the rest of Europe, are mobilized in their support of the Ukraine, in potentially, if ever the conflict were to escalate, the general population, would be ready to accept that, given the fact that there has been, 70 years of peace in Europe, and that I think European citizens are, slowly being awakened to the fact that geopolitics is happening, at their front door, effectively.
Very nice. Let me ask you further, Professor Benjamin Barton. Didn't the Western family of nations come too late to a realization of what we have in Vladimir Putin? I mean, despite the seemingly chaotic nature of the initial invasion, the weight of Russian forces and superior firepower will likely prove decisive, don't you think?
Yeah, I think in the short term, at least, the conflict is going to drag on to the point of whether Russia has either obliterated any form of Ukrainian resistance, whether it's kind of demobilized and decommissioned any type of Ukrainian armed force left in the country, and of course has driven out the regime. I think that seems to be the short-term objective, and I think that Putin is not going to stop until that happens. As to the tardiness of the response coming from as you say, the European family of nations. Yes, I think so. But I think it's never too late to respond, in the sense that I think Europe should have been more aware of the strategic threat from 2014 onwards. Of course, now they can't go back and change history. But I think the response has been still relatively swift. It's not as if there's infighting which is preventing Ukraine from receiving weapons which is being funneled through Europe. I think, to the contrary, that mobilization, that unity has appeared relatively quickly, because on issues of a geopolitical ilk, sometimes NATO and often the EU have struggled to come together, in unity. But I think that here, given the reality of the threat taking place very close to its borders, actually the response hasn't been as slow as it could have been.
Very nice. And in a similar note, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken called the Russian military operation in Ukraine as a war crime. And he mentioned that in the last 3 weeks, Russia destroyed many cities in Ukraine and targeted civilians. It even pushed millions of Ukrainians to flee their country. Let's take a listen.
Yesterday, President Biden said that, in his opinion, war crimes have been committed in Ukraine. Personally, I agree. Intentionally targeting civilians is a war crime. After all the destruction of the past 3 weeks, I find it difficult to conclude that the Russians are doing otherwise.
Back to you, Professor Abdelwahab Nasri. It seems like Russia's military operation in Ukraine has provoked a sudden and potentially long-lasting shared resolve across Europe on the need for a stronger, more independent security strategy after decades of reliance on the United States. What are we expecting in the months to come?
All right, a good question in the fact, because it is within the framework of futuristic visions and futuristic approaches exactly. So as I mentioned before, that this phenomena is really hard to deal with. As international relations analysts and researchers, we need at the moment to wait and to see the aspects of this phenomena in general, and the repercussions of this war. So that I will try to mention it as war, because at least we have 1,000 killers for the moment with citizens on Ukraine. And also we need to analyze the individuals, whatever the president of Russian Federation and the president of Ukraine. So according to the individual framework, I think the behavior of those of the president of Russia is with misrepresentation visions. I think all they are dealing with their interests. And the geopolitical factor is really important in this way. Also, all the conflict is based on three factors, which are the security, the economics, and the political. Whatever on borders, whatever on armament, and whatever on social changes. So I think in the future, we need to take simulations models. As modern nations or the model of the international organizations, in order to discuss and to analyze realistically and clearly this conflict or this war and other coming and the futuristic wars in the future, because the international relations and the global arena is really hard, so that the world is changing. We need, as researchers, as students, as thinkers in this field, to take an action with that and to create simulations in order to create at least resolutions to help United Nations, for example, to help other international organizations and the governments in order to take hard action. So in the future, as I mentioned, we have to take training sessions as simulations and negotiations with those crises in order to take realistic solutions.
Very nice. Benjamin Barton, I was to ask you the same question regarding security strategy, which was after decades relying on the United States. Are we expecting that Europe is going to change and become stronger?
Well, Europe has been talking a good game about that for some time. I mean, for as long as NATO exists, and you can see that NATO is obviously the go-to organization here, it's really the fulcrum. In fact, NATO is even more important here, particularly for Russia and the Ukraine, than the European Union is, even if, technically, if you go back to what happened in the Euromaidan incident 2013, and then the ultimate invasion of Crimea in 2014, that was more related to the European Union. So the issue is, if Europe is to, let's say, organize some kind of common security and defense, or even move towards something akin to a European army, this could only really happen if NATO was no longer around. I mean, of course, America can support this and has on and off over the past 7 decades or so. But the reality is that too many European countries want to maintain that alliance with the United States. I don't think that treaty alliance is going to go away anytime soon. Now, French President Emmanuel Macron has tried at the start of his presidency and also very recently to bring up this idea of collective European defense, maybe akin to an EU army. But the fact is that that's been talked about. The EU does have a common security and defense policy, but when you look at what it actually does, it's so far off being able to rival the armed forces of a nation state such as Russia's, that if you take the Americans out of the equation, that threat level, that deterrence against the Russians is nowhere near as high. So right now, they're talking about an issue which should have been dealt with long ago, effectively, in creating something akin to an EU army. The last point to take into consideration here is it's all well and good in the scope of war for Europe to be talking about this, but what message does it send to its eastern neighbors? The creation of an EU army, if it was to be fully integrated and operational, is simply going to add to this cycle of mistrust, this cycle of potential violence, because the signals it sends out to Europe's enemies is one of aggression. So is that really what we need right now? I'm not sure.
Yeah. And a different question would be, are we going to see any international trials against Putin? Are we going to see him in international court being, let's say, trialed or sued for criminal, or let's say, this crimes in Ukraine?
There may be an attempt to bring him to trial, but I mean, if Russia does not recognize this court of law, and to be honest, I think autocrats around the world tend to be in that situation of not wanting their country to be signatories to these kind of treaties where, there's always a risk that if things go wrong, whether in terms of civil strife or conventional warfare, then suddenly there may be, claims that they have to then stand in front of, they don't want to be like Milosevic was, basically, because, that's possibly the worst scenario for a leader like Putin. So even if a good case is brought and war crimes are identified, if Russia doesn't play ball with that, then effectively it's going to be meaningless. Unless there is a dramatic political shift in Russia whereby, civil society, influential businessmen and women, members of parliament, for example, deem this to be a way out of the crisis, or, the kind of the final curtain on the war, Perhaps, but I really think that's very unlikely, and it's not really going to get the Russians to budge. I think it's more a political ploy again to make sure that the American electorate, that the worldwide audience is effectively against Russia. It's part of this drive to isolate the Russians, to get them to stop.
Very nice. On Thursday, the United Nations Security Council convened an emergency meeting at the request of 6 Western nations, seeking an open session on Ukraine before of a vote on Russian humanitarian resolution that they have strongly opposed. Let's follow.
The United Nations Security Council held an emergency meeting to discuss the Ukrainian conflict at the request of 6 Western nations. The Security Council witnessed a war of words at the Security Council, where officials accused Russia of conducting war crimes and violating international humanitarian law.
WHO has verified 43 attacks on healthcare, with 12 people killed and 34 injured, including health workers. In any conflict, attacks on healthcare are a violation of international humanitarian law.
One way to end this madness. President Putin, stop the killing, withdraw your forces, leave Ukraine once and for all.
On the other hand, Russian authorities maintain they did not start the conflict and have repeatedly decried reports of Russian military setbacks or civilians' deaths in Ukraine as fake news.
The accusation about the shelling of the infamous maternity hospital in Mariupol and the shelling of the Mariupol theater and the fact that Russia is not allowing refugees to leave and that Russia shelled the Moscow Sultan Suleiman in Mariupol and the Russia during ordering automatic weapons to shoot a bread line and turn it off, and this has been refuted many a time.
The meeting came in the wake of Russia's Security Council resolution proposition on Tuesday, which is expected to be voted on by the Council today, Friday. However, Nebenzia said that Russia decided not to seek a vote anymore, stressing that Moscow is not withdrawing the resolution.
Back to you, Mr. Benjamin Barton. One would argue that the war in Ukraine has in some respects dispelled a whole series of liberal illusions that misled many people during the post-Cold War period. Those illusions include the idea that a major war could never happen again in Europe, and that the spread of economic interdependence and the expansion of NATO would mean that eventually all of Europe would be a vast zone of peace. What European countries have now discovered is that hard power still matters in world politics, and one can't simply let defense capabilities a trophy for several decades and expect you'll never need them. So in a sense, we are returning to a lot of fundamental principles of, one would argue, realist views on international politics, which is unfortunate because a realist world is often a bleak world. What do you think, Professor?
That's a very good question. I think we need some context to address this particular question first and foremost. I think you're right, indeed. There is complacency. Europe has been strategically complacent for the longest of time. If you look through the academic literature on the EU as a global power, as an entity, I go to the EU because it's the one which is often referred to here, as being able to participate in global politics. The literature is very critical, saying, well, effectively Europe's living in a bubble and the rest of the world is doing geopolitics. But I think that's, in a way, to be expected when Europe lives under such an important security umbrella, which is, effectively run by the United States. And I mean, even former US President Trump criticized Europe for, not taking its own responsibilities from a strategic perspective. I mean, his criticisms were perhaps directed at trying to get Europe to pay more, but ultimately he wasn't wrong in the foundation of his argument that in Europe for too long, I think countries have been under the illusion that realist principles don't necessarily apply to that part of the world. But just to provide some kind of background information here, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, early 1990s, the United States was effectively looking for a strategic vision for itself in a way to fill its strategic void, because it spent the Cold War, fighting a very clearly identifiable enemy. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, suddenly you've got this void, which President George Bush Sr. tries to fill, by talking about a new world order. At the time, countries such as Russia, such as China, they're still on either recuperating from what's just happened, in the shape of the collapse of the Soviet Union, or just in that process of modernization, of nation building. At least that's the case of China. So in a way, you could argue that it's normal that European countries have been in that state of complacency, because the threat from Putin has only really started to gather pace over the past decade or so. Yes, you did make that point about Chechnya, but that Chechnya is still very far away from European borders and could have been considered as a domestic issue for Russia. That's very true. I think the warning signs should really have been, 2007, 2008, when Putin starts to make these statements about, greater Russia, about, conglomeration of Russian-speaking nations, kind of harking back to history, revisiting history, reinterpreting history on the one hand, and on the other hand, taking a bit more seriously the fact that within Ukraine, within the Ukrainian political establishment, quite clearly, there was a desire to move towards NATO, to move towards the EU, which I think European countries kind of brushed off as, well, we can just kick the can down the road. But now this has really come to a head. And, you're right in saying that we've gone back to a kind of a bit more realist type of situation. Now, that's not to say that it's necessarily going to last. But I think the reaction from European countries has been more impressive than what ardent critics would have expected, and me included, to be honest.
Very nice indeed. And in a similar note, a second wake-up call was the reminder that powerful countries often do pretty horrible things when they feel, rightly or wrongly, that their security is being endangered. The United States did the same in 2003 by invading Iraq. It was every bit as illegal as what Russia is now doing. Is the Russian military operation a turning point for Europeans? We are now putting our money where our mouth is, and you're seeing some actual decisions that suggest there is a sort of psychological shock taking place right now in Europe. What do you think, Professor Nasri?
All right. I think all of the ministries of foreign affairs in other states and the EGOs and the NGOs across the globe, they are taking clear actions about that. Here we will deal with the strategy and the geopolitics. Also, United Nations, as we are seeing in the previous weeks, they are dealing clearly with the resolutions against Ukraine. And we have to bearing in mind the importance of maintaining, strengthening, and international peace founded upon freedom, equality, and justice, and also in order to respect the human rights. So human rights and peace, security are one of the most important factors within the United Nations framework and strategies. Also, we need to understand exactly the relations among nations, exactly in order to take a political and economic and also a social system, so that all they are depending the development. So United Nations, they are recalling the final act in order to take many events and conferences about security and cooperations. As we are seeing now that the United Nations draft resolutions are very clear, and as the professor mentioned, the modern United Nations are really important. I will urge all the thinkers in this field, all the researchers, in order to take simulations, negotiations of model United Nations or model other organizations, so that in order to at least deal with this phenomena, because we have to ask a lot of questions, and the answers in the international relations are not very clear and are not in the balance. So always we are asking questions. Always we are weighting the phenomena. Here I will try to mention an important point. Global affairs, and especially dealing with the international crises, so that as we are seeing the Russians-Ukraine war, or the Russians-China's operations, and other global affairs crises. They are not clear, and they are not stable, and they are not in the balance. So we need to ask questions. We need to make our research in order to understand clearly the behavior.
Okay, your point is clear, Professor. Russian Defense Ministry spokesman Igor Koshenkov announces that the Russian military and its separatist allies are now fighting in downtown Mariupol, a beleaguered strategic Ukrainian port in the southeast of the country.
In Mariupol, the units of the peoples of Donetsk, with the support of the Russian armed forces, tighten their grip of encirclement and fight the nationalists in the center of the city.
Back to you, Professor Benjamin Barton. Why Mariupol? What could be the outcome if this city falls?
Well, as mentioned, it's a strategic port on the south. I think the Russian incursion through the south of the Ukraine has been more successful. The aim ultimately is to encircle Kiev by moving up from the south, taking all the major ports, controlling movement in the Black Sea from the Ukrainian ports, whether it's military vessels, of course, but also commercial vessels. We've seen that with an attempt to block the export of grain, which ultimately is a fundamental part of the Ukrainian economy, which will only further cripple the Ukraine and therefore make that Ukrainian resistance all that much difficult, to organize and to sustain. This is quite clearly the attempt is to move from east to west across the Ukraine's south, with targeting these main ports. So Mariupol first, and then moving westwards ultimately to Odessa, which is an even more important strategic point. And once those are secured, then that allows to basically move from the south up to the north and join the troops which are moving in from the east and through Belarus into the north of the Ukraine. So to create that sentiment of encirclement. And it's interesting that the general there was referring to Donetsk and the Donbass area as a kind of almost as a separate entity fighting alongside the Russians. So to give them credibility, in their ultimate claim for independence, for sovereignty. I imagine that's one of the aims that Russia's aim is looking to push for once the Ukrainians are surrendered. It's to allow these territories to somehow separate themselves from Kiev's sovereign rule, effectively.
Very nice. Thank you for these clarifications. Dmitry Medvedev, Deputy Secretary of Russia's Security Council, warned the United States that Moscow had the might to put the world's preeminent superpower in its place and accused the West of stoking a wild Russophobia or phobic plot to tear Russia apart. He added that the special military operation in Ukraine was necessary because the United States was using Ukraine to threaten them. What's the card Russia is hiding to be so sure of what it's promising to the West? Professor Nasri?
Okay, I hear you now.
Yes.
At first glance, Russia's initial invasions of Ukraine seems to suggest a change in the approach of Russian armed forces. And Moscow here was perhaps will take an action that missile strikes and will take invasions of ground forces, so would lead a swift surrender of the Ukrainian state. And as Putin appears to have anticipated to repeat the Russians' decisive in order to caesar at least the invasions of this event. And but we have to see exactly more similar interventions. Yeah. And also the armed forces here in Russia were initially enabled in order to transform their military superiority, certainly in terms of numbers, and also into military and strategic success, and thousands of Russian troops in order to prove it enabled to secure the north of Russia. And
yes, thank you, Abdul Wahab Nasri. Benjamin Bratton, please. It's the same question. What could be Russia hiding to be so sure of itself? I mean, seeing these, let's say, downright threats?
I mean, to me, it sounds more like the Russians are trying to dominate the narrative over the war rather than. Of course, I think it's obvious and natural in a way for Medvedev to say something like that. He's trying to undermine the unity that he's seeing in the West, with the United States really at the forefront of trying to organize a resistance, and he's trying to, see if there is any weakness that he can exploit on the American side, on the European side, through this threat, because the Russians know that ultimately European countries and Americans don't really want this war, because this war could be very costly if it was to escalate between, NATO on the one hand and Russia on the other. But at the same time, I think the Russians have kind of underestimated the extent to which there is unity and there is willingness to organize a resistance to allow the Ukrainians that window of opportunity to push the Russians back. Or
Very
at least,
clear. Very clear, Benjamin Barton. Thank you so much. We're running out of
You're
time. Thank you for both guests, Professor Nasri and Benjamin Barton. It has been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you, dear viewers, for tuning into our channel. This is the end of our special coverage for today. Stay tuned to our channel for more coverages on the file. Goodbye.